this sort of what we call a gotcha culture here, where we've got you. We've found a way of sensationalizing a story. It's going to make the headlines. It's going to belittle that person. Forget the fact that we've now written their career off and we've lost a very, very good person. And that's very, very sad indeed. But it fits into the type of people that we are actually encouraging to step forward into the public office. And I constantly ask people in business, even at schools as well, put your hand up if you would be a parliamentarian. And the younger age groups, very excited about potentially participating. And the older you get, the less and less those numbers are. And that means you're actually gifting it to a very small grouping of people who aren't the brightest and the best.
Hi, this is your project management cowboy coming back to you with another podcast, once again on one of our favorite topics, leadership. Now, we've had the wonderful privilege of already doing one podcast where we talked about somebody, Todd Weiler, former Secretary of the U.S. Army. We kind of got to pick his brain about leadership and politics. And after that podcast, I said, we're based in Europe. We need to ask somebody who has political experience in Europe. And I was brainstorming and I thought of somebody that I knew from my past. And we have the wonderful privilege of having, I have to make sure I get his title correct, right? The Right Honorable Tobias Ellwood in the house. Hi, Tobias. It's a privilege that you take time out of your busy schedule. We're gonna the topic of this podcast, the overall topic is leadership, and I've decided it would be great to once again take a politician into the arena because I'm going to make a generalization. Everybody loves to complain about politicians. Everybody's complaining about politicians not being leaders enough. This is not going to be a podcast where we're going to bash politicians unnecessarily. There's not going to be any kind of sensational journalism. It's not about trying to trick you with any sorts of questions, but I think this would be a great opportunity for our listeners. And I'll try to be that proxy for them, is to ask some questions that we've always wanted to hear about politicians and kind of hear it from somebody who's been in the arena, who's thrown his hat into the sphere and can maybe give us some valuable insights. And you're a smart cookie, so I think this will be a great exchange. I'm really looking forward to this. Tobias, you want to kind of say where we know each other from?
Yeah, we go back a long time, actually. We grew up together and were involved in the Scouts, the American Scouts.
Yeah.
I grew up in Vienna. There we are. My goodness, there's an old picture.
How do you like that?
My father worked at the United Nations, so that took me to Vienna. And there I joined the American Boy Scouts and made some lifelong friendships. And it certainly did inspire me when it comes to leadership to think about myself, my role, my contribution, the sense of responsibility of duty I have, and where I could go with that. I was actually not very confident as a boy. And I think certainly the Boy Scouts helped shape me and gain my confidence. I didn't do particularly well at school at that point, made up for it by going to Harvard later as postgraduate. But at school, wasn't the brightest boy in the class. In fact, I was at the back of the class most of the time. But Scouts really did help shape that, and I think we both share that of where you're with like-minded people, and in a world which is changing fast, you get to learn and interact and get opportunities to lead and in different forms. So very much appreciate perhaps the beginnings, if you like, of engendering that sense of duty that we're on this world together. What do you need to do to become a leader? And I think the Scouts does a great job in that.
Yeah. We'll talk about the Scouts maybe a little bit more in just a moment. Tell us a little bit about your background. I love to. I have to say this: you're the first person on this podcast that actually has a Wikipedia page. So we're very blessed to have such a celebrity on board. We always like to kind of introduce our guests. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who watch this who obviously know who you are, but there's going to be hopefully also a lot of people who've never heard of you and can maybe learn from your life's wisdoms. And we kind of like to start off with introducing our guests. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and your we call your passion journey.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, Vienna was the starting point. Actually, the original starting point was New York. My father was there working with the United Nations. I was born there, stayed there for just 3 years, enough time to get me an American passport. Which
so we have that in common.
Yeah. So pleased to have that. And that's very, very useful indeed. But then moved around, and that really, I think, engendered an internationalist feeling to the world for me. Living in Germany, living in Switzerland, Geneva, and then Vienna, growing up in Vienna. And I felt a sort of calling, if you like, that I might one day go into politics of some form. And having a British passport and American passport, I had to make a big decision. Where would I go to university? I knew university was important, and I needed to complete that before entering some form of career. Would it be America or would it be Britain? And I took one look at American politics, and I have to say, it's quite crazy. A lot of money involved as well to make it.
I want to talk about that later. That's I think that's going to be an important topic.
Yeah. So I ended up doing my first degree at Loughborough University, and Loughborough is famous for producing a lot of our sports characters. So it's a sports university, and Steve Backley, the javelin thrower, was there. Sebastian Coe, one of the great runners of middle distance runners, was there. We crossed over. He was doing research whilst I was there, and so I did engineering, design, and technology, but played a lot of sports. Really enjoyed that.
What did you do in particular?
I played volleyball, which is an odd one, but growing up in
Vienna, you're tall.
Sorry?
You're tall.
I'm tall. But where volleyball became useful was when I was then later in the army, unsure what I wanted to do after university. I then ended up joining the British Army. And anybody's unsure what they want to do, going into the forces is just a fantastic stopgap, if you like. Because again, you learn more about yourself. You add to those leadership credentials. And of course, it looks good on the resume. Anybody in their right mind would want to take advantage of the skill sets that you benefit from being in the army, particularly the leadership piece, which is what we're focusing on today. But during those periods, I had some difficult tours, including in Northern Ireland and Bosnia and so on. And you get a lot of time, intensive operations, and then a lot of time off. So I went to California and ended up playing beach volleyball, semi-pro, and that's where I put it to use.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I don't know how you managed to get that all time-wise into your calendar, but we have another thing in common. I noticed on your CV, it says here you were a member of the University Officers Training Corps, the UOTC, which is hilarious. Another thing we have in common. In the United States, it's called ROTC, and I was a member of ROTC myself. How was that at university? That must have been another a great place to get your first impressions of military concept of leadership and organization?
Very much so. I didn't just sort of sign up after I left the army, left the university. The OTC, the same as ROTC, very much shaped my appreciation for what the British Army does and continues to do. In fact, all services too. And like I say, any employer will look kindly at anybody who's actually had a bit of military service, particularly going to Sandhurst, our equivalent of West Point. And so going there.
But you did that after university, right? Was that to do the final touch?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So you go to Sandhurst. You get, if you like, another postgraduate degree, if you like, from going there, which I think is also. I went to West Point actually not long ago with my Defence Select Committee. We can talk about that later, which was fantastic to see the comparisons.
Yeah.
Pleased to see that at West Point they're not playing American football; they're playing rugby, which I thought.
They do all sorts of things there. Yeah.
But rugby, again, to leadership. Apparently, there's more leadership opportunities in a game of rugby than there is in a game of American football, where it's all about the quarterback. So I don't know. One to be discussed. I suppose.
Yeah, I think that'd be a hot topic.
But certainly the OTC very much was. Again, you'd go away on a weekend and live in, a dugout over in Wales when it's raining, and you come back and you look at everybody else. What did you do on the weekend? Well, I did something that really tested me, that really made me realize what sort of character I have. And but it strengthened you. You learn who you are. You absolutely you learn more about yourself. And so. Well, that was a building block, certainly, to joining the Royal Green Jackets. And they're a particularly useful regiment because they're the ones, as the name implies, that worked out that wearing a jacket of green on the battlefield. Remember in the olden days, red tunics, and they're very easy to see.
Yeah.
No, not the Green Jackets. They worked out for your jacket.
They were smart.
you can't be seen so easily. It eventually cottoned on, and everybody's now doing it.
Yeah. So, what branch of the military is? I mean, it's Army. I'm guessing, right?
So Army infantry.
Army infantry.
So the way it worked is that the Green Jackets were the king's chosen men.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones who could shoot a little bit better. They were given a jacket of green, and they were the ones that would take out the drummer or the bugler, because that was the communicator on the battlefield, telling which way people to go, and of course the officers and so on. So it was the
if I'm not mistaken, they were also responsible for scouting, right?
Sorry?
Were they not also responsible for scouting?
So Lord Baden-Powell was a general, and then he left the armed forces and then realized that he could use his skill sets. There was a lot of youngsters that would like to learn these skills, separate from the kinetic side of the military, but living outdoors, learning how to exist outside and survive and so forth. It can be quite fun. And that's where the scouting movement absolutely started.
No, I meant that the Green Jackets, I think I recently saw a small snippet of information on them. I believe the Green Jackets were also responsible for scouting, to send scouts forward to check whether or not how to do reconnaissance, I think is the correct term.
Yes, that's right. Where, again, a jacket of green would be quite useful, so you're not seen.
Yeah. So how long were you in the military for?
So I'm still in. I serve as a reservist.
I believe you're a lieutenant colonel, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. And,
kudos.
So I stayed in for about 7 years. At a point where you go back to the classroom, you learn more about the wider concepts of warfare, Army, Air Force, Navy, land, sea, and air, and so on. And rather than doing that, I wasn't really ready for that. To then stay on another number of years, I thought time to get out. So I got out at an interesting time at the rank of captain.
Yep. So you mentioned beforehand that you felt a calling to politics. When did that calling come to you?
It was actually to do with decision making. Who makes the decision? Who do you bestow your own power as a person to make decisions for you? And I looked around, particularly when I was in the OTC, actually. Mm-hmm. What's the kit that we're using? Why are we using this kit when I know that there's better kit? The boots I'm wearing are terrible. Yeah. I could buy better boots down at the mountain warehouse. Yeah. And then you ask, well, actually, it's not the generals, because they would turn around and say, don't blame us, blame the politicians.
Okay.
And then I looked to see who was the defense minister, and they had no military experience whatsoever. Yeah. And that's when I realized, that's interesting. How do I then become a minister? Could I ever do that? And then I looked at some other people's careers, and it usually starts down at a very local level, parish council, district council, and you work your way up there. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what I did. I went down to the very base level where there was about 7 of us in a room discussing minute issues. You believe it or not, how many ducks are on the local pond that we had in a village, in village politics. And then that was a stepping stone, and it was a 8-year project. If I hadn't become an MP by 8 years, I'll do something else.
So you were very laser focused on following up with this career, and you had a plan on how to execute it. So yeah. I think for those of us who have never functioned in politics, how does one get into politics? What is that roadmap?
The first question is, what do you actually stand for yourself?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're just doing it to be at the podium, to enjoy it, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that is called populism. It
yeah.
means you're doing it for the profit.
And there's a lot of that around.
You're doing it because you like the sound of your own voice.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of politicians out there. You have to have a sense of purpose of what you believe in, and then work out where you fit in the political spectrum. And just the way British politics works is that you need to join a party because they're the vehicles that help you and support you all the way. And there is an overlap, as there is between the Republicans and Democrats, probably less so now, but certainly in the past, whereby you could be a right-leaning Democrat or a left-leaning slightly Republican, and there'll be that middle ground. Likewise in British politics as well.
Yeah.
So I'm a light blue conservative, if you like. So I believe in responsibility, opportunity, and indeed.
I'd like to go into greater detail when we get into that. But let's maybe start off. I'm a little familiar. I wouldn't say super familiar. Let's talk a little bit. So for those of you, for those listeners who don't understand the British political system, actually, your political system is a two-party system.
Well, it was, but there's more space for other parties to engage.
Okay.
Unlike your system, where it's very rigid indeed. I mean, very, very rigid.
Yeah, it's either one or the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas in the British system, you have a third party. In fact, the original two parties, like the Republicans, Democrats, were the Tory party, now the Conservatives, and what was called the Whig Party, which is now the Liberals.
Yeah.
The Whig Party.
Are they called Labour now, or?
No, that's an interesting thing. The Labour movement started in the early 1900s and developed from the working class.
Okay.
They wanted representation. So through the unions and so on, they grew up and eventually overtook the Whigs. So it then became Labour versus Conservative.
And you have a third party now, you said, as well?
So the third party is now the Liberal Democrats, but we now have other parties. The Green Party is now making a little bit of headroom.
Yeah.
And the other party that's doing very well is Reform. And they are much further to the right, led by one Nigel Farage.
Okay.
Who will not stop to tell you too often that he's friends with Donald Trump. His best muckers, frequently visiting Mar-a-Lago and so forth. So it's a curious place we are now, because we have something called the first past the post system. So in my jolly seat of Bournemouth, I was lucky to get over 50% of all voters going into the booth. That's great. But
I think
could
54.
also win if I had only 35%, but a lot more than anybody else. So you can actually win, even though you've only got just over a third of the voters there. So the system is outdated a little bit. It does need to change.
Now, another thing, your title was PM, so you were part of the Parliament, but in the UK, you also have this interesting concept, I think not unsimilar to what we have in the United States. We have the Senate and the Congress. In the UK, you have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. For those of us who are not from the UK, can you give us a quick synopsis so that we can understand it better?
So the Lords were the old court, going back to advise the monarch of the day. And they were never elected. They were the grandees. So if you had a big estate and you inherited it, you came down a duke or an earl or whatever like that, you became those around the king or queen to advise them. Now, the merchants, the traders, started to make money and become ever more powerful, and they slowly wanted a say. And that's how the Parliament side of things, the elected side of things, then got going. And as time went on, the House of Commons became ever more powerful, not only taking power away from the king or queen, but also because of the power taken away from the Lords as well. So the Lords is now seen as a revising chamber. Most of the decisions, and a prime minister must be an elected member of Parliament as well.
Okay, but it's not like in the United States where Senate still has quite a bit of power. The House of Lords is kind of a more...
No, the House of Lords is seen as a revising chamber.
Which means what?
If there's ever a tussle between the two, the House of Commons will be seen as the senior. Whereas I think in your system, the Senate...
the Senate is more powerful.
I met them. They tell me that they are more powerful.
Yeah, they sit in office longer as well. Okay. Yeah. So tell us about this roadmap. How does one become a politician? For anybody who's listening and says, I want to do what he did.
Right. Well, the first thing you need to do is, as I say, establish who you are, what you stand for, where you sit in the political spectrum, and then probably in Britain you have to reach out. So
political leaning. But I wanted to challenge you, because what I heard, and maybe it's just my wishful thinking. I don't know if you're familiar with a book from Stephen Covey called Principle-Based Leadership.
Yeah, I know him well.
Is that kind of what you're referring to also? Not just decide what party you're going to go with, but because I believe, and this is some of the questions that I have lined up for you in a little later on, kind of go in that direction. It's one thing, if I maybe explain myself, one of the things that annoys me in the political situation right now is I don't truly believe that anybody is purely one thing or another. I think we have a wide spectrum of different political opinions. Some of them might be more liberal sometimes, some of them might be more conservative. But I find that right now, I think there's kind of a push to this, you have to commit. You have to commit and you have to be all out, which means you basically, and I've seen it interview after interview where, and this is where I question people's leadership, where they say, you know what, I'm going to compromise what I stand for and believe because I'm towing the party line. So when you refer to knowing what you stand for, I'm hearing more principles than just political leaning.
Yeah, I mean, you cover a lot there, and it absolutely is a true reflection on where politics is today. one of my heroes is John McCain.
Yes.
And I can look at him.
One of the last real Republicans.
Yeah. And he, listen to him. There was I remember stark commentary when he talked about Obama being, somebody came up to him and said, "Isn't Obama evil?"
Yeah.
And everybody in the stadium went, "Yeah, isn't he horrible?"
Yeah.
And that is the what we call yah-boo politics.
Yeah.
On one side, boo-boo on the other.
Yeah.
And he said, actually, no, he's got different views, but he's not evil, and he means well for America as well. And that, for me, I thought, my goodness, that's a wake-up
I remember
call.
I saw that. I've seen that interview. It was with, I think, with an old lady who asked him.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's absolutely right here, too, is that if you want to advance, if you want to impress what are called the whip's office, because the whips, I think, on both sides.
You have a whip as well?
We have, well, they came from us. We invented it.
Okay.
And they're the ones that govern the mechanics of how the House of Commons operates.
And maybe explain to anybody who doesn't know what a whip is, real briefly, what a whip does.
Okay, the whip's office control the House of Commons. So the Labour Party has got a whip's office, and the Conservatives have as well. And they're the monitors, if you like, the school monitors. And they watching...
Kind of the lead figure within the party, right?
The chief whip is critical. So it's the third or fourth most highest person within your political party. And in fact, they're so powerful that the Prime Minister lives in number 10, the Chancellor lives in number 11, and the chief whip lives in number 9 down in
No, really? I didn't know that. I didn't realize that.
So that's how powerful that person is.
Yeah.
And if you impress the chief whip is responsible for the daily running of the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is dealing with all the policy and this, that, and the other, but the daily running is done by the chief whip and the whips. If you impress the chief whip, then you're likely to be picked up for promotion. What's the best way of impressing the chief whip? Is to sycophantically say nice things about whoever is speaking at the dispatch box at the time. Yeah. If you dare to speak your own mind, that is not a career enhancing move. And that's the dilemma that we face today, which is what you pointed out. How does your own political views themselves that you want to promote actually be sit in the fact that you actually are part of a collective responsibility? And so you've got to choose your battles. That's what you have to do.
Well, if I may summarize from my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that the whip is usually the lead of your party, puts forth agenda points, does negotiation with the own party members to make sure that they're aligned and that they toe the line, and sometimes also crosses the corridor to see if they can't get other people from the other party to follow whatever bills they're trying to push through. That's kind of what I understand that a whip does.
Yeah, I think that's very, very fair. That's essentially what happens. It's running the mechanics of the day-to-day operations of the House of Commons. And a lot of legislation, much as you see it under Prime Minister's question times, where it's a lot of argy-bargy, a lot of theatre. Yeah. Actually, there's an awful lot of agreement that takes place too, because there's policy which, even if the other opposition were to come into power, they're not going to unpick. They're not going to replace. Just roll with it. So they won't bother voting. Some of them are more controversial. And we have a big one this Friday coming up, which is pertinent to what's going on in America, which is the right to die, about the right to take your own life, as we see in the Switzerland, the Dignitas model. So massive debate, really, one of personal views. So it's not being whipped this time. It's a free vote, as it's called, and they're quite rare. But that's happening this Friday, so it's quite interesting.
Oh, interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Very, very interesting. So you left the military with a focus on becoming a politician. We still want to hear the roadmap. So you became a member of the party?
So I took advice from a former colonel from the Royal Green Jackets, who was in Parliament at the time, and his name was Sir Geoffrey Patty. And I'd never met him before, but just the Green Jacket military connections, you give him, I say, oh, I'm interested in this. And I caught up with him and he said, Tobias, go and earn some money, gain some more experience. You've got the military, that's fantastic, but just get some other experience of life as well and come in a little bit later.
So you went into business, or what did you go into?
Yeah, so I worked for the London Stock Exchange and learned how the city operated. And then I worked for Allen & Overy, the law firm. And then at the same time, concurrently, I was working my way up that ladder. Parish council, district council.
You a barrister as well?
I'm not a barrister, no. I'm doing business development for Allen & Overy. So I had to look after Emma Watson.
Okay.
when her father was a senior lawyer in my firm.
Okay.
And I didn't really know who she was, but she would arrive downstairs and I'd have to take her upstairs. I haven't got a clue who this. I mean, I was polite to her. I wasn't rude or anything like that.
Did she come with her wand?
I didn't even know what she was up to. It was only later that I put the two together. But that was quite fun. Not that she'd even recognize me now, but that was quite fun. Yeah, and so I got some other experience from other aspects of life. And I think the criticism I have, and you get a little bit of this in America as well, is that people work for a member of parliament, they do some jobs inside the lobby environment, then they stand as an MP. They're not bringing any fresh experience.
Yeah, it's a closed circuit. I kind of have the same beef with consultants. I do understand why consultancies hire people directly from university, because they have this esprit, they have this motivation. They'll work for nothing. They'll follow orders. I understand why you would hire, and you're usually idealistically bright. Maybe not experienced bright, but they're idealistic.
But the Senate has a rule, which means you cannot be a senator until you're over 35.
Yeah. You can't become president.
If that's not a direct order, go away, get some real experience before you turn up here.
Well, I noticed you did an MBA as well, and I noticed that there's at least 7 years between when you did your bachelor's and your MBA. Traditionally speaking, that was the idea behind an MBA. No, and a lot of people go do their master's directly after they do their bachelor's nowadays.
No.
But back then it was like, I think in the MBA I did with the University of Minnesota Carlson Business School, I think they required you to have at least 10 or 12 years of business experience before.
Yeah.
And that's what I would also say about a consultant. I think if you're really going to be worth your salt, as you say, as a politician, I think you should have some external experience. You should know what a liter of milk costs. You should, have worked for a for-profit organization, have some idea of reality before you go. And the same thing with consulting. I think, what are you consulting if you've never experienced what it's like to manage a team, to live up to certain goals that you have set for the quarter or for the year. So that's definitely that.
Yeah.
So you worked in the free market for a while.
And then the way it works here is that you are invited to stand in a seat that you have no chance of winning.
Okay.
No chance. And the idea is you get tested. The party is looking at you. Can you handle a campaign? And if you can't, well, you're not going to win the seat anyway, so it's not too much of an embarrassment. But so there's competition. So I ended up fighting a seat in Worsley, which is just west of Manchester. And first time ever, I went to see Manchester United play at Old Trafford, and it was fantastic. And so I really enjoyed that, but there was no chance. It was a deep old Labour, it was a mining town. And Terry Lewis was his name, and he was so delighted that I was there. But I was just one of about 8 wannabes.
You were cannon fodder.
Exactly, and so he was very sweet. He was very friendly, but he knew that it didn't stand a chance.
Let me ask you another question. We've done a number of different podcasts talking with different psychologists on the concept of capability assessment and personality assessments. Do they do that in political parties? How do they? I'm assuming you get a mentor. Do they do some kind of personality or capability assessment? How do they pick future candidates for politics?
So there is a selection weekend, which is actually based on the military one that we have, the Regimental Commissioning Board.
Yeah,
and it's now it used to be a couple of days when I did it. It's now just one day. But they do an assessment, and they check to see whether you know the right stock, whether you've got experience, if you've been a councillor before, that always helps. What your general interests are. They're testing you as to whether politically you are in the right party, and what your motivations are.
Do they check for ethics?
They check that as well. Well, you sign something to say yes, I'm a good egg. But a lot of these don't come out until later, do they?
Yeah.
So that they do all that. Unfortunately, the training beyond that is very, very limited. I mean, we're both familiar with the armed forces. You take anybody who's a captain, a major, a colonel, a brigadier, or a general, and there's no way that they could advance to the next rank unless they did some exams, unless they excelled themselves, unless somebody wrote some good
uniformity of standards, uniformity of training. I mean, there might be some slight variations in the training, but if you look at in the military, this is I've had some other military people on my podcast, and we've talked about this. I think this is where the military really has a leg up on private industry, because they'll challenge you. They'll give you more responsibility than you ever thought you would have at a certain age, but they'll never leave you alone. And there's always a standard, and there's training that's involved, and there's a continual 360 feedback loop in the process as well.
I'd agree with that, and actually to some degree in Civvy Street, also, in the banking communities and so on, you're only going to get there, and if you are required to go somewhere, they will ship you out on a course.
Yeah.
I dared, because when I got into politics, I got elected in 2005. I wanted to make my arc of interest defense, security, geopolitics, the international stuff. And I went to the whip's office and I said, listen, there's this great course at Harvard on national and international security. Any chance that there's some money available that I can go and do this to make me a better person if I become a minister, which I eventually did.
Yeah.
And he looked at me, his good friend of mine, Alistair Burt. He said, what? The taxpayer pay for MPs to go out on courses? You got to be kidding. Even though Britain would benefit by me being a better decision maker, understanding things and the connections. Now, sadly, I lost my brother in the Bali.
I read that. My condolences. Yeah.
Yeah. And I got some inheritance from that. He was a teacher, head teacher in the international school in Saigon. And I got some inheritance from that. And he was a facilitator to get the best out of other people. And I thought, what better use than to use that money to do the very course. So I went to Harvard and using that money. And I honestly, and what was really curious is that when I turned up there were civil servants from Britain. So the taxpayers' money was being used for the advisors inside the Foreign Office and the MOD, Ministry of Defense. They shipped people there, but MPs would not be allowed to go there.
Interesting.
So we had this bizarre system whereby you could be the Secretary of State for Defense, never done the ROTC, never worn the uniform in anger, certainly never even been in the Scouts or anything else like that. But somebody likes you. The whip's office say, well, not, why not? And then you become, it's in charge of a thumping department like that. And it is wrong. And that has happened so many times.
Yeah. So what was your experience in Harvard like? Is it all that it's cracked up to be?
Yeah, I mean, it was a short course. It was the summer course, but it was great fun. We went to Fenway Park and watched the Red Sox. But yes, it was fantastic. It was wonderful. I mean, the course itself was fantastic.
Yeah.
We had people like Kissinger turn up and other things like that. Some of the great speakers of the day.
Well, they have great professors there, but I think also part of this is also part of the whole concept of politics. I think probably what you also experienced there is the possibility for networking, or
completely. And it was the Kennedy School of Government where I was doing this work, and it's absolutely fantastic. I think you've got such a fine institution there, and was great fun. Some of the connections I made, I still have here today. But it's that desire to keep learning. You're a sponge. You want to be able to keep understanding of what, particularly on the internationalist side of things, given how people are talking past each other on the international stage so much.
So what was next when you came back from Harvard?
So then it was I'd done my no-hoper seat in Worsley. I'd managed to not disgrace myself, managed to get a slight movement of the percentage towards the Conservative Party, and then I applied for a winnable seat. And that's when I ended up in Bournemouth, which is the very south of England. Bournemouth, not many people know much about it, but it does have a football team that's now in the Premier League that not long ago just beat Arsenal and Manchester City.
You're still proud for your constituency. Let me ask you a question. This is always something that I found interesting. How does one win over a constituency of an area where one maybe didn't grow up? I think isn't developing a personal brand a huge challenge for a young politician? How did you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, they're voting. You vote. Why do you vote? Why does anybody vote for anything? And you could probably put it down to four things. One is that there's a new leader in town. Tony Blair, love the cut of his jib. Think he's going to take Britain places. I'm voting for Tony. I'm not necessarily Labour, but I'm going to vote for that person. Yeah. The next one might be, well, I'm part of a union. I'm going to vote Labour that way, or I'm a Conservative. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Or it might be a single issue thing. It might be like green issues are important to me, so I will vote. So it might be a particular issue. There's a motorway being built or a hospital that's required. That's going to be my candidate. And then the final one is, well, I like the local person. I like who might represent me, down here in this area. They're going to be good for Bournemouth in that case. So it's actually a combination of these things. I have to say the biggest one is simply the party itself. Okay, so at the last general election, the tide took me out. The Conservative Party has been in Bournemouth, I don't know, forever. And suddenly we lost that seat because we were inept for the last 4 years. How many prime ministers have we had? The Southern Thoroughfare, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and then
I think you Brits have been trying to compete with us Americans when it comes to the buffoonery of things.
Yeah,
but that's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But let me get back.
So that's why. And there's time for change. I mean,
let me get back to that, because that's too easy answer, and I think you can give me a better answer than that. Maybe I can ask you the question in a different way. How, and this, maybe it's not an easy question to answer because it's a fairly broad and ambiguous question, but I think it's a powerful, and I think it's one that all politicians have to look at, in particular in difficult times like it is now. I think the number one question that everybody asks themselves is, why do voters vote for certain politicians and not others?
Well, I'm not sure we're attracting the right politicians is my first answer to that. Because
I think that's a secondary question that you can derive from the first, because I think if we're complaining about politicians, which I think is legitimate, okay, I think we voters also have to ask ourselves the question: who are we voting and why are we voting for them? But I think there's a certain mechanism, a psychological mechanism, and I don't want to judge it in a negative sort of way. I have this from swarm theory and from herd animals, this psychological wisdom that's not mine, that other psychologists have picked it up, is that says that charisma is an essential part of leadership.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's personality. I mean, you see this.
You have to stand for something. And even if you stand for something terrible, if you stand for something, a lot of people have asked me, why do we have the president or the upcoming president that we do in the United States? I would say that the justification for it has been that people are sick and tired of bland politicians, that when you put them in front of a microphone, they can talk eloquently and say nothing. They stand for nothing, or they seem to stand for nothing, and you always get a wishy-washy answer where you say, what did he just say? And I think the tendency has been, give me, and I think George W. Bush also kind of tied into this principle, being able to talk in the vernacular of your constituency, give simple messages, seem authentic. I think the extreme case that we have now, I think people are willing to listen to a leader that sticks out, even if what they stick out with is terrible. And I think you Brits have some examples of that as well. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is vision.
Yeah.
Is somebody, you need to be able to buy into where the person wants to take you.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily, a good leader is somebody that actually can take you to places that you didn't want to go. Okay?
I think Rosalind Carter was famous for that similar quote.
So a popular leader is somebody who will take you to places where you'd like to go, but actually isn't necessarily possible. And we saw this with Liz Truss particularly, who said stuff in the media, courting a particular slice of the electorate, making promises that would never survive contact with reality. And to some extent, we saw that a little bit with Trump as well. He can't end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, but it sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. And sometimes they say stuff which actually will be popular, but it's not necessarily the right choice. Pulling out troops from Afghanistan immediately like that, without a follow-up plan as to what happens to that space. You've now got ISIS-K, which is going to be one day bigger than Al-Qaeda. Why? Because we've left a vacuum. We've given up on 40 million people there. Okay. Not the right choice longer term, but a fantastic choice, bringing troops home, calling it a day, because everybody was getting fed up because it didn't look like it was going anywhere. And that is, so first of all, clarifying your vision is very, very important. But you touched on something that's also absolutely critical, particularly in this day and age of social media, which is the ability to communicate, which is the ability to get your message across. You need to excite and you need to energize. You need to have that grit, that tenacity, that determination that says, yes, I can't even remember what you said now, but I'm going to follow you. And to some degree, that actually emulates what we require out of our armed forces. When a officer is standing by the trenches saying, come on, guys, I'm going to take you to somewhere dangerous. But if we stick together, there's a chance we might get through this. And that's what politicians should be doing more of. But there's an easy line to take, I'm afraid. There's an easy route to follow, which is to tell people what they want to hear, to listen to the chorus, and then chime along those lines. But that doesn't necessarily give you the answers that you need today. And, make America great again. What a fantastic, fantastic line. It really, really is. But ultimately, you can't make America great and make other places weak at the same time. There needs to be something that works for both. Because if you isolate America, and America does become separated from everywhere else like that, and Europe is the great example of that, of saying that Ukraine thing, that's for you to sort out. Well, the problems here will end up being America's problems, and that's the short-sightedness of it all.
I'd like to get back to that hot topic, maybe a little bit more detail later on. Yeah, I let me ask you another question, because it's kind of also on the tip of my brain right now. I think if you were to force me at gunpoint to say one I don't know if I would say positive, but one amazing aspect of present politics that is fairly new, and as a politician, you've always been aware of how easy you can become a hero, and or not easy. I think you've done a couple things to fall under that title. But it's also fairly easy to fall out of favor. I think in the past, if there was one transgression on your slate, you were gone. You were canceled fairly quickly. And I think what we've seen, the only maybe positive thing I've seen in the present political climate is that we finally have somebody who says, listen, I don't know if you remember the old Shaggy song, It Wasn't Me. Yeah. I maybe phrase it in a different way. I think what I think we can learn from the present political climate is that you can make a mistake and still stay the course. You can still be resilient. You can create a certain Teflon personality if you have the courage to stand your woman or man. And I think that's something that has been sorely lacking in previous political figures. I think we Democrats are famous for it. If you get one cancelable offense against you, you're gone. You said something, oh, you look lovely today, to a woman who took offense to it, or you used the wrong gender title. Then you have to, take your stuff and go. But the other party has a mentality. You can grab them somewhere and you can become president. So I'm not saying that the behavior is appropriate, but I think the concept of resilience is something that I think all politicians could probably, because I think what it does is it reaffirms for the voter, hey, this person can make a mistake and come back. What is your opinion as far as the political sphere is concerned? Is it conducive to being able to make a mistake? Can you come back from a mistake? Isn't that kind of the hallmark of a good leader, to take a blow? To quote Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Isn't that part of being a good leader as well?
Absolutely, it is. But you're right. There's an intolerance in our society today that prevents that from happening. There's sort of what we call a gotcha culture here, where we gotcha. We've found a way of sensationalizing a story. It's going to make the headlines. It's going to belittle that person. Forget the fact that we've now written their career off, and we've lost a very, very good person. And that's very, very sad indeed. But it fits into the type of people that we are actually encouraging to step forward into the public office. And I constantly ask people in business, even at schools as well, put your hand up if you would be a parliamentarian. And the younger age groups, very excited about potentially participating. And the older you get, the less and less those numbers are. And that means you're actually gifting it to a very small grouping of people who aren't the brightest and the best to make the decisions. And you have a different system than us, because your president gets to pluck the brightest and the best from whoever, and hopefully they'll be attracted.
In theory, yes, he does.
to be in the cabinet. Our cabinet is very much made up as parliamentarians alone. You have to be an MP as well. So there's always, you have this connect with the people that elected you. Now, maybe that'll change in due course, but right now that's the way it is.
Would that be a recommendation you would have for your political system to maybe loosen those constraints?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we saw this as an example, and people gave him a bit of grief. But when David Cameron came back as our foreign secretary, he was immediately put in the Lords, which is the other way of doing it. So he was ennobled, which you can do very, very quickly, and then allowed to sit as our foreign secretary. Now, he enlivened that place. He really did. He's a class act, talking about communications, but also his experience and breadth of knowledge, to help on the foreign policy side was absolutely fantastic. So that was like a halfway house. But I think there's an awful lot of people that don't want that overexposure of going through the ranks of being an MP. And don't forget, actually, the American model actually depicts this very well. This triangle of the judiciary, which is separate from the legislative, which is separate from the executive. In our system, the executive and the legislative are blurred into one House of Commons. Okay. And therefore, there is some advancement there, I think, to be done. If were we to sit down and recognize, if you want Britain to lead, and this is another piece which is very important to me, if ever there was a demand for greater international leadership, if there ever was a demand for Britain's voice on the international stage to be heard again, then it is now, given how crazy our world's become.
Oh, I think we can expand it onto the European. You mentioned it beforehand. I think we are definitely going to be facing some challenges with a new president coming into office that questions fundamental pillars of Western civilization, which in my opinion is NATO and partnership shoulder to shoulderness with the European Union. And now we have a president who, if you ask me, is somewhat of a Manchurian candidate. Yes, I said it and I'll stand by it. I hope that we'll be able to handicap any negative actions in that direction. But I also think, and I'm going to say this as an American, I feel kind of like you. I'm a European American. My parents are originally from Austria. I grew up with the awareness of being American all my life. But I have a big heart for Europe as well. And I think the European Union is a grand adventure, and I think essential to the future of Europe. And I think that this might be the opportunity to finally cut some of the big brother ties, not completely. I don't think, I hope that Europe doesn't ever turn its back on the United States and vice versa. But I think this might be a reprieve where it might be a call to action where Europe should stand up on its own two legs and become a little bit more independent and become a bigger, more dominant player in the global sphere of politics, and also take ownership of NATO. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, with this, we've gone through our own transition with the EU, pushed by an individual. I mean, you talk about leadership, but there's also the sway, the spell, if you like, that an individual leader in the form of Boris Johnson had on our party, where nobody dared challenge him. It got to that place. And it's taken us, he, during the referendum, was happy to remain part of the single market. So from a trading perspective, still be part of the club that could trade, politically distanced from the EU, but the rest. And as did Farage, as did David Frost and other big voices in the referendum debate, we've ended up having no relationship at all. The deal we've struck is the most extreme you could possibly imagine, and it's not good for Britain's economy.
Well, I believe if I read your CV correctly, you were not for the split.
No, but I did recognize, and across Europe, this was also the case. When you see people like Le Pen, the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, Austria has got your own movements there too.
Well, they all feel liberated and invigorated by what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah, and there's this nationalism that's now growing a little bit. So the idea that the EU can answer some questions but not all, that needs to be recognized. I think as a trading club, absolutely important. From a security perspective, it also has a role to play, particularly in the non-state actor space, because NATO does state on state. It doesn't do terrorism. It doesn't do criminality. It doesn't do migration problems and things like that, or or extremism. It does big state stuff, such as Russia and so on. That's what it was designed for.
Yeah.
So the EU can then fit into that. And the fact that Britain slid away, distanced itself, and even if it was just the optics, even if, that wasn't the intent here, to the rest of the world, it looked like a global player that everybody respected and revered, close to the United States, had the ear of in the White House, and then was the first place to call from America when we don't know what's going on in Europe. So to throw all that away seemed absolutely madness. I'm only now starting to repair that.
Yeah, I saw UK. I'm very fond of the UK. I've always saw you as the Three Musketeers, French, German in the UK, and I find it was. The word on the tip of my tongue is reprehensible, but that's maybe too harsh of a word. I found it a pity that the Brits decided the way they did. But I think once again here, I think from an analytical perspective, if you're committed to leadership, I think you can't blame your constituency for the way they vote. You need to blame yourself and ask yourself, what is our responsibility? And maybe we can turn this into a question. Across the world, we see a shift to a more, I wouldn't call it conservative, but it is conservative, a more right-wing tendency, a more nationalistic tendency. Why do you think that is?
I think because a lot of the problems in Britain were blamed on the EU, that we didn't have the ability to, or they got blamed, for example, the migration issues, things like that, that somehow it was sold that we would suddenly become independent. We could make all our judgments ourselves. And actually, the way the world is going is that we have these massive trading blocks developing: America, Europe, and Asia, led by China as well. And if you're not in one of those economic camps, then you're outside of them. You can strike all the trade deals you like. And we can talk about the Commonwealth. But if much of the Commonwealth now has been overtaken by China and the One Belt, One Road.
BRICS, yeah.
So we need to then recognize what is our relationship with Europe, and we need to upgrade that as well. But recognizing that there is also, because we're an island and historically we've been somewhat independent, that we would like to retain some of that. And I think the consequence of Brexit was that this political ambitions, led by mostly France, I have to say, of wanting to politically integrate Europe, has actually come to a halt. It's come to a threshold, and that's a good thing. Yeah. So the question now is, what next for Britain? And I think you're going to see another generation coming through wanting a closer relationship with Europe. But it won't be another referendum for some time. But certainly the younger generation are far more engaging than the older generation that, as I say, has this almost romantic idea, going back in history.
Illusionary fantasy of yesterday.
Britain had its own empire, and then we can do it all. No, what we have, though, and people miss out on this, is massive convening power. We're the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. We have reach, and we are respected for our understanding of the world, of understanding what's going on around the world. To the United States, don't land in Calais on D-Day. Land down in Normandy. Why? Well, we're telling you they're ready for you in Calais. Okay, we'll take your advice. Fine. And it's Ukraine is a great example of that. Rather than complaining about Trump, which we have no right to, that's the American people. Whatever you may or not do, he's in the White House for 4 years. We've got to deal with that. Not only that, there are problems for us to work together. So the first thing we should be doing, instead of whinging about the fact that it is Trump in the White House next, is to say, by the way, Donald Trump, this is what we need to do to secure and support Ukraine. Otherwise, Russia won't end there. He will continue his campaign in other parts of Europe. So spelling out the wider ideological challenge, rather than just saying, let's put this fire out in Ukraine and that's it. That's our job. That's what Britain's role is it to explain and lead, provide the thought leadership, but also provide the convening power too. We can't do all the heavy lifting, but we can certainly take the first step forward.
What you're doing right now is an exemplary it's an example of exactly what I think a political leader should be. Is things will not always go your way, and even if they don't go your way, you have to be able to have a vision of what are there's in business we say there's never a disadvantage that doesn't have an advantage. You've mentioned beforehand, if the younger generation does not feel heard, if they feel like we old fuddy-duddies are dancing around their nose and trying to go backwards instead of forwards, it should be a call to action for them to become more involved in politics and pull up their themselves by their bootstraps and take action. If Europe is maybe not so enthralled with a non-EU or NATO favor of the United States, then if it's important to them, and then we're going back to principles, okay? If the principle of NATO and the principle of the European Union is really that important to us as Europeans, it's nice to have the Americans on our side, but I'm going to say this is American. Screw them if they're not. You know, and I don't mean screw them in a negative way. I don't want to thumb their nose. Like I said, I don't think we need to go into conflict. But I think there's a huge potential to say we need to stand something. Only thing that kind of gives me is kind of a worrisome thought. If I look at the political scene right now in Europe, the only people that stick out are the negative ones. The only and I think that's what we're lacking. I think we're lacking an Angela Merkel, and you can like her or not, but she was an extraordinary. She was the Iron Lady of Germany. I mean, she stood for something. She had charisma. She had vision. Not everybody liked her, and I, you know, you can have sentiment one way or the other, but she was a true leader. Let me ask you, who were your big idols in leadership? Are there any recent or some from history that you say this is the kind of politician that I always aspired to be?
Yeah, I think the ones in Britain, Disraeli is one of our first British prime ministers, and he managed to advance what conservatism actually is. And I was touching on that before, and got slightly sidetracked. But you know one of the challenges that the Conservative Party has right now is, what do we stand for? We've got this right-wing party, Nigel Farage, growing, as we have across Europe. What should we be doing? Should we be joining forces with them? Or should we be actually going for the middle ground for the floating voter? Because in Britain, there's a 1/3 of the voters have never make a
silent majority, we call them in the United States.
And in America, you know, there's a bell curve, and that middle bit, you grab that, you've got the extremes. If your party goes to the extreme, like Jeremy Corbyn did under Labour, never going to get elected. You go to the right, you're never going to get elected. So that middle space, and Disraeli started that off, but he went further than that. So rather than say it's just not only enterprise, opportunity, and responsibility. So enterprise is the entrepreneurial side of the Conservative Party. The opportunity is to make sure that anybody can give themselves a go. And then the responsibility is the responsibility of your own self, to your family, to yourself, to look after yourself. Don't expect the state to look after you. You stand up on your own feet.
You're kind of sounding like Maggie Thatcher now.
And to the nation too, to a sense of patriotism.
Yeah.
So those three keywords summarize for me what conservatism is all about. And Disraeli did that, but he went a step further, and he then said, we've got to recognize that there are people in this world that are less fortunate than us. Let's have a safety net to look after those, because the Conservative Party in his day, this is from the 1900s, simply looked after themselves, and so he advanced the thinking to give you moderate conservatism, and others followed suit. So Baldwin did that. So did Churchill. Middle of the ground conservatism. He was a liberal Democrat at one point. Thatcher too started off in the centre ground. Macmillan, David Cameron. All our successful prime ministers have been from the centre right, and that tells you. Today, what we should be doing here in the UK, we should not be moving to the right. If
I were to, in my weak capacity of passing any wisdom, if I'm not really in the position, but if I were asked to, I would say I think the most important thing that if we're not happy with the direction of where some of these parties are going, we need to create a viable alternative by being transparent and truly standing for things that matter to the broad population. And I'm not talking about 27 genders or any kind of silly nonsense like that. I'm talking about real day-to-day things that matter. Let me ask you a weird, very generalistic question, but I also asked this of my friend Todd from the United States. What do you? We talked about principle-based. What do you see as the purpose, the overriding purpose of political leadership in a democratic country?
It is to, for me, how can I describe politics? Politics is the wise distribution, exercise, and maintenance of power. So it's all about power. Now, is that politics? Is it done wisely? Is it distributed fairly? And then to who?
So fair distribution, which is an important part. Todd didn't mention that. Okay.
So for me, the modern leadership needs to encompass all those aspects. Unfortunately, it doesn't, because the very things we're talking about at the very start of this discussion is the fact that social media pulls you in different directions. If you want to secure votes, don't tell people the truth. They don't want to hear the truth. The truth is horrible. Tell them what they want to hear and you'll secure their vote. Now, that's fine, but it's rather short-termism, and that's what populism actually is telling the audience what they actually want to hear.
Well, I think the modern populism is even worse, because this is something that I've noticed in the last couple of years. If you look at the Republican Party, and I want to put this up front. I used to be a Republican a long time ago. Back in the day, I think the last Republican I voted for was George W. Bush. I couldn't consciously vote for them now for what they stand or claim to stand. But one of the things I've noticed is kind of a rhetorical polemic strategy that I keep seeing from the Republican Party is they will call out legitimate faults of society and in politics, that the media is controlled partly by politics and that media is not always honest. I always say that the balance and we can talk about this. I think this is important because I think the fourth branch of the checks and balances is the media. And the media has always kind of listened to the advice of government. I would say about 60% freedom of speech and 40% kind of maybe tapered. And they call this out and they say, oh, we need freedom of speech. And I just recently heard one politician in the United States say, yeah, we're gonna dismantle the education system because we have such a terrible education system in the United States. But the terrible thing about this polemic is I sense deeply that they don't mean it, and they're going to dismantle it and make it worse. So, we talk about free speech. We say, the legacy news is fake news, but then we cater to a news channel that doesn't even know the principle of news. Okay? There's no concept of veracity in anything they report. It's sensationalism. It's the Völkische Stürme or whatever the Germans had a while back. It's this playbook. It seems like we play with the concept of transparency and freedom of speech, but it's okay to lie. I find this a terrible principle. So I think if I were to give the middle of the road politicians a challenge, I think they need to understand social media. I think they need to understand the language of the people. They need to talk about things that are relevant to the average voter, because most people don't have time to think about politics. They're thinking about how are they paying their bills. Do I have a flat? Will I ever be able to afford property? Is my pension taken care of? I think these are the things that have huge potential, but we need to get outside of our comfort zone and start daring to communicate. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'd agree with you. The challenge that I think elected officials face is firstly, as you say, what is important to those who have voted for them. And if you want to stay elected, that becomes the very first primary objective. So I met senators at the big Munich Security Conference, one of the biggest conferences on security in the world. And I asked them directly, why are you holding up that $60 billion support package to go to Ukraine? It's all ready to go. Why are you voting against it or holding it up? And they said, one of them was from, I think, Nebraska. Correct me if I'm wrong. And he said, the good people of Nebraska don't even know how to spell Ukraine, let alone where it is on the map. Why should I be supporting them? Be seen to be supporting them when actually they're concerned about migration and all these other things. So for him, it was actually, even though he himself personally knew, because he was at Munich, he appreciated how serious what Russia was up to, where it was doing, that he still was minded to actually answer to his base, to the people that are going to re-elect him, because that's what he wants to do, is to be re-elected. And it's a tough call for him to stand up to his own people and explain in more detail, which takes time. As you said, most people don't want to talk about this sort of stuff. And that's where the leadership actually comes in. But I think there's some fundamental errors in the building blocks that allow our system to have evolved. You touched on it yourself. Laws were made in America which no longer demanded that any broadcaster had to show the other side of the story. I can't remember what it was called. It was
the Hayes Law.
Hayes Law. There we go. And that straight away.
It was a framework that created similar to the way what they have in Germany. In Germany, they have the Medienbeirat, which is independent newspapers, and they put forth standards and ethics and code of ethics, and they kind of adhere to it. It's kind of a communal agreement. But the Hayes Law was a very stringent law that stipulated exactly what you were allowed to say on the radio, what you were allowed to say in TV, how you were allowed to say it. And some people would say, hey, that's an interference with freedom of speech. But what they understood back then is that broad media has a very powerful hold on individuals, and if it's in the hands of the wrong people, you can propagate terrible things.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that moment in time has changed American politics completely. It allowed the advance of Fox News that now becomes, the voice of the right, and then CNN has grown to be the voice of the left. When I was in America, and I was there for when Ted Kennedy died, and you go onto CNN, and there was huge tributes to him about what he'd done in the Northern Ireland peace process. He's done an awful lot. Switch over to Fox, and it was all about Chappaquiddick, was it? Where that girl,
drowned.
It was all the negative.
Yeah.
I then moved to BBC America I moved over to BBC America in order to get a combined story which showed the positive and the negative. And if you're getting this diet of news only from one particular source, you can't complain then when your nation itself then becomes so polarized, which is where America is today. The second point I'd actually say is if you go into any congressman's office on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, and look at their map of their own constituency, their own district, it's a curious shape where they've managed to, through legal challenges, have little bubbles and baubles to make sure that it's always going to be Republican. Yeah. There are never any contested.
They've manipulated. This is what I found reprehensible. Is the Republicans have always been kind of the purveyors of traditional values and ethics and being correct. I remember the big fuss they made about the sexual activity of Bill Clinton. But now when the shoe is on the other foot, there's a different standard. Same thing with when you say people are against the Ukraine. Quite honestly, the number one reason why we should be against the Ukraine because we all grew up in the Cold War and it's against Russia. I think Ronald Reagan, who's considered the great messiah of the Republican Party, is rolling over in his grave, seeing what the Republican Party has become right now. Basically a vassal of Russian thinking, but I'm getting off course here. On one hand, it was the Republicans who got us into Iraq and Afghanistan, and nobody batted an eye. And you know what? The good people from Nebraska didn't know how to spell Iraq or know where it was either. So I think this double standard is something that I find totally amazing. But I think the big difference between the two parties' approach right now is this unabashed, so what? It's our team. Kind of, you said you've been to a Manchester game or a Bournemouth game, right? Fans of a particular ilk will hold to their team regardless of what their team does, and this is what I'm seeing in American politics. And I agree with you. I think this polarity in the media. We all remember the days of newscasters that would just bring the news and not tell you their opinion. It's incredibly difficult to go in the media now and actually listen to the news without somebody telling you their take. I'm not interested in your opinion. Tell me the news.
Yeah. So I think until these fundamental flaws in our whole political architecture are acknowledged and then fixed, then it's going to be very difficult to get out of this cycle. you're then still looking at personalities to enter politics and to speak their mind, which is why Trump does so brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly, because he's become a celebrity. And if you want to make your mark, I mean, the moment that I knew I thought he would win the election was in one of the big rallies. He turned around to his audience and said to all you lovely ladies out there, tell your husbands to get their fat butts off the sofa and go and vote. And that basic language that he then used was an illustration of the fact that a celebrity can get away with that.
He has a knack for winning over people that he's not for. One of my best friends is African American, is gay, is married to a Latino, wonderful people. I love them to death. He's a Trump voter. I'm like shocked. How can you vote for this person? You know, I mean, if you spend some time with it, he has certain arguments for it. And you know what, just because you're a certain skin color doesn't make you one political member or another. But he has, I mean, he got a huge part of the African American vote. He got a huge part of the female vote. He managed to appeal to a lot of people. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is why. But one of the things that we kind of indirectly talked about, which is the problem with the media right now, I think there's no accountability. There's no consequence for telling a lie. And let's bring this back into politics. And I think this is something that can apply to the private industry and CEOs as well. I think our culture is still kind of imbued with the concept of power by the right of God, and our leaders are untouchable, and they're above us. And yes, we might cancel them, but I don't think our culture has evolved so far to have true accountability. And I'm not talking about the witch hunts. We have plenty of witch hunts where we chase people out of office. But I'm always shocked to see CEOs who ruin companies and then are given a golden handshake of $100 million and sent on their way. And there's no other ultimate consequence. And I see this in politics as well, where certain politicians make terrible decisions that have huge impact and they're not held accountable. Do you believe that accountability is something that we need to work on in leadership as well?
Yeah, I mean, there is this collective responsibility that you have. So in the British system, it is the cabinet that does that. We have a cabinet-led leadership capability, different to the presidential design that you have over in America. So the prime minister does have certain powers, but ultimately can't, through executive decision, go off and then declare war or send troops somewhere without cabinet agreeing. There must be that ability to confirm what's going on, or indeed stand up to the prime minister too. That is the construct that we have in this country. But there isn't any accountability, if you like, when things go very wrong, other than when you boot the person out. And the difference between our system and yours is that if you end up with a bad apple, you got to wait 4 years to turn them out. Whereas in our system, it just took 44 days to get rid of Liz Truss, because our system does allow that.
Maybe we should be a little bit more accurate in what I understand about accountability, because one of the things that I think the Republican Party is fighting for very strongly now is to empower the president more and to make sure that he has or she has immunity. And I can understand why that's important in a political sense. If Cameron made a political decision that was difficult to make, and it didn't go well, that's just how the cookie crumbles. So I don't think I'm talking about accountability in the sense of, do we go to war or how do we deal with certain partners? I don't think that's where the accountability is so important. I think it's important in a different way, but in a more subtle way. But I'm talking about, I'm going to make a harsh statement now, and I'll ask you how you feel about it. One of the things we talked about in the previous podcast is I said, I'm a huge fan of the democratic principle, but I think our system has some flaws baked in, some immature flaws baked in. And I think what American democracy has kind of degraded to a large extent, and I don't know how we're going to solve this, is that our democracy is for sale.
I think that is fair.
If you look at how much money is involved, the lobbies, what influence they have, they write the laws. I mean, If somebody were to ask me what is the purpose of government, I'm going to quote one of my favorite quotes from the books Guns, Germs, and Steel. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They say the purpose of government is to be the biggest, baddest gang in the land. And their number one client are the people, because although the people theoretically in numbers are powerful, they are the least powerful because they have no unity. They need leadership, and that's the function of government. And I remember when I asked my friend Todd what he thought the purpose of government, he said something very traditional that we say in the United States was that the Democrats look out not only for what the majority wants, but they also protect the minorities from the majority. And that's a very idealistic and wonderful thing, and I completely agree with it. But while he was saying it, I had this thought, and I said it to him. I said, I think the modern purpose of government, political leadership, is that political leaders protect the 99.99% of the population from the 0.01% of the population that would otherwise take advantage of us. And I don't see that sufficiently. Do you understand what I mean with that? If we're talking about distribution of wealth and the inordinate amount of influence that robber barons or billionaires have on the political system and all the benefits they have and none of the accountability. Would you agree with that assessment? Or
I would. It is a consequence, though, of the evolution of our democratic processes, if you like. If we do live in a free market, open society, then there will be some people who will generate greater wealth, and then through that wealth will seek greater influence through the political machine. It's interesting that you talk about the robber barons, because that was a very interesting time in American history, because it took an American president, another one of my heroes, Theodore Roosevelt, to then say, hang on a minute, this isn't where America is going. It's not in Americans' interest. And I can't help thinking a little bit that this experiment that Trump, I think, will take us on, with Musk next door to him, advancing a very new approach to how government should operate, including getting rid of the Department of Education and so on. It will either work and be, oh my God, why didn't we do this before? Or there's a possibility that we're going to end up with a repeat of the 1900s, whereby the high-tech operators are able to then effectively have influence with the politicos, and to the point whereby the democratic processes, as we know them now, are completely eroded. And it will require then a massive reset on the flip side of that to then say we cannot have companies, operators, chief executives, chairmen, and so forth, who are just so powerful that they can ring up the president or whoever in the White House and say, do X, Y, or Z, and it actually happens. That we've missed accountability, that actually Congress itself is then almost bypassed from that perspective. And that's why I think this what happens in the next 4 years will be very, very telling indeed.
I'm afraid that my inclination would be that we've let the fox be in charge of the coop of hens, but I keep my fingers crossed that I might be mistaken. I would love to be mistaken, but I think even if my fears come true, I think it's a call to action for us citizens and for other politicians to maybe start building a resistance and come up with a better alternative.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself ever returning to politics again?
That's a big question. I certainly felt that I'd ended prematurely, that I still have this energy, this zest, this desire to participate in the electoral system, partly because also stepping on the outside is actually quite healthy occasionally. You get a different perspective and you can see. Remember that film, The Dead Poets Society? Do you remember that one? And he gets them all to stand on the desk and look at the classroom from a different viewpoint. And that was quite stark for me to say, actually look at things from a different angle. And I look at Westminster, I walked past it today, and you realize that actually Britain is not hanging on every word that you say in the chamber. There's an awful lot of Britain that doesn't care less about what goes on in there. But there are moments where it does matter. And there is a better way. It's not being utilized. I mean, go back to Stephen Covey. He asks 2 questions. I think it's in the 7 Habits of Man. He said, do you do stuff every day which you're told to do because your boss tells you to do it, or that's expected of you, but really doesn't change anything? And all of us can say, yes, we do. A lot of our life is full of stuff which we really shouldn't. It's not going to change anything at all. We do. We turn up to meetings. Stuff is on the agenda, whatever. Secondly, do you have skill sets that could be used to advance what your boss does, your company does, or whatever, but are not being utilized? And if the answer to both questions is yes, you're not a happy bunny because you're doing stuff you don't understand why, and it's superfluous, really, what the company does. Not only that, but you're harboring skills and energy that are not being tapped into. And boy, is that Westminster to a T, is the fact that you've got good, capable people in there now too shy and hesitant to speak out because of the systems itself, unable to make the right decisions as well. But every day going through processes of discussions and bits and pieces, which you watch and you just think, why are you actually doing that? Because you're not changing anything at all. You're doing it because it was done that way 100 years ago, and we've not updated the whole system.
Yeah. Now you've had a glorious past and have experienced different countries. I think you got probably lots of insight into your father's job, how the UN works in many ways. You had experience to Boy Scouts and the ethics and the concepts of leadership that were taught there. You had the glorious experience of a wonderful culture of the military as well, learning from there, the good and the bad, I'm sure. You've worked in private industry. You're back in private industry now. You've had exposure to the I think political leadership in reality is the pinnacle of leadership. It's the most important, most essential to society. What are principles that you stand by, or if somebody were to ask you what principles they should consider to aspire to, what would be some of the principles that you would advise yourself or others that they have to bring to the table if they want to be an outstanding leader?
I think if you want to be an outstanding leader, you have to manage your career carefully, choose the battles wisely, ultimately be true to yourself. Don't make any decision which you look back on and regret. I worked closely with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, and he would often look at a problem and say, what is the right thing to do? It might sound very simple.
We don't ask that question often enough. That's the essential question.
It's very easy to do what's in it for me? What's in it for my party? What is actually the right
What's
thing
the easy way to go?
Yeah. And so many times I remember him saying that. What is the correct, if we're honest about it, what would be the most sensible and courageous thing to do? And that is being then honest with the situation. And then you gain more respect. The trouble is, it's very easy to be lured to the dark side, play the game, and then end up sort of in power, but powerless because you're then tied to policy situations that you personally don't believe in. And the best example of that is Boris Johnson being tied to Brexit when he himself had written speeches on wanting to be a Remainer. He was a Remainer.
I wasn't even aware of that.
He was a complete Remainer. And he worked in Brussels as a journalist. And he would often go prior to because people really had views on Brexit, but prior to the referendum, he would go to a dinner party, a conservative dinner party, and say, is this the Brexit-leaning audience or are they Remaining? Because I have a speech in one pocket for each side. But he himself always recognized the appointment. You talked about France, Britain, and Germany being this troical, direction of travel. When those three countries agreed, that's where Europe followed. That's where Europe went.
You had momentum. You had checks and balances. You had sufficient cultural affinity and differences to make a well-balanced decision.
Yeah, and Boris is a great example of being lured and saying things because it suited him, and he changed British history because of that. There's no doubt about it. Absolutely. And I think he will never put his hand up and admit it, and none of the Brexiteers do, to say what damage this model of Brexit has actually caused Britain. But that's it. So being true to your beliefs can be very, very tough indeed. But if you're convincing enough in your arguments and you pursue it in depth, you can then win people across, because that is true leadership. I go back to this said at the beginning, taking people places that they didn't realize they wanted to go. That is true leadership.
If I may, I think what you said is so powerful. I'd like to translate it for the listener who might say, that's his context. I don't know how I would translate. I think it translates into every context of leadership. And I'll use my humble context as an example. I think one of the things after, being primarily working in the line organization and learning how to serve, the large structure and system, I've always had a leaning towards the more special forces type thing and the project type thing, because I like the idea of thinking outside the box, having more autonomy, knowing the rules on how to bend the rules. And one of the things, and that's how I ended up in project management as a consultant. And one of the things, and it's not easy to do, that I've always used as an adage or a mantra when I interact with clients, is I always tell my clients in a loving sort of way, I said, listen, you're not paying me to tell you what you want to hear. You're paying me in a kind, constructive, but honest sort of way what you need to hear. And I think that's a skill set that leaders must develop, is the ability to authentically and convincingly tell people what they need to hear, and also to treat them mature enough so they can hear it. I often get the legitimate question back, is have you ever been fired? I said several times. But I've also been hired back by a number of companies who fired me initially because I told them what I thought, when it turns out that I was right. So I agree with you. I think at the end of the day, when you look in the mirror, you can't, and you're being held accountable for something. It's nice to be held accountable for something that you truly believe in, and not whatever the populist opinion of the moment is.
No, I think that's very, very fair indeed. I think it was Hoover that said, give me one-armed economist, because economists would always say, on the one hand there's this, and then the other hand there's this, when it came to giving advice on the economy. And I think the same applies more widely on the geopolitics as well, is that you do need a space. You need a grouping of people. You need a red team that will tell you what you actually need to hear. Because if you don't get that from cabinet, then they are actually lying to you.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, again, our system, the way it works, is that many of those around the table might actually, certainly in our construct, are vying for your job. They want to succeed you, so they're actually quite happy to see you fail. And that is the dilemma. I would say that of all the prime ministers that we've spoken about, Margaret Thatcher was very good at allowing people to speak their minds. Yeah. And again, she had the big beasts of Michael Heseltine, Kenneth Clarke on one side, and you had people like Norman Lamont on the other side. And these were big beasts in British politics. But on the left and on the right, around her cabinet, so she actually promoted the best. She had the best minds around the table, on one condition, that when you left the cabinet room, you were all in agreement with the final decision of the day. Yeah. And you just had to suck it up, and that's where it should be. And quite
since you mentioned Maggie Thatcher, I have a split opinion on her. I'm not super knowledgeable about her, but I think this is also one of the challenges. If you were to ask me what I think conservative, and I think there's absolute legitimacy to conservative parties, but I think one of the challenges they faced, if we go back to this concept of is democracy for sale, I think the overall sentiment on the street is that they don't look out for the voter, they look out for the corporations. And you might say, yeah, but without corporations, we can't be a healthy and wealthy country. I think the big challenge is, it's not a contradiction. I believe that conservative parties can show a certain social note as well, which I think a lot of them would say doesn't exist. I don't think that it exists in the Republican Party, unfortunately. But yeah, I've done a little bit of research on you. You're a fairly prolific writer of articles. For anybody who's interested in seeing some of your expertise, and it's quite wide spanning. You have papers on strategy, on the European Union. I think you're somewhat an expert in the Middle East as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was fortunate to be the foreign office foreign minister responsible for the Middle East. during a very interesting time when we were affected by ISIS, Daesh, and so on. But yes, and then more recently on Ukraine and Russia. So it's I've been very fortunate to meet a lot of people and engage, but also be able to speak around these things too. So it's I've been fortunate with the wide span of the globe that I've been interested in.
Yeah. For anybody who says, you know what, I found this interesting and I'd like to know what he's doing now. What are you doing now?
So I work for myself, really. I'm advising, doing a lot of geopolitical work. So any of those articles and commentary is on my website, tobiaselwood.org. And so I like to share my thoughts and so forth. I just did a piece coming back from the Middle East on what Trump's policy might be on Iran. Mm-hmm. And he likes the deal. And if he can meet Kim Jong-un, why can he not meet the Ayatollah? Yeah. So my view is very binary. He'll either help bomb, possibly with Israel, Iran and its nuclear capabilities to hold them back, or after decades of Iran's proxy poisonous influence across the Middle East, could we encourage him to say, make your mark, make your legacy, come, try and strike a deal to engage with Iran, because the population is calling out for change. It won't be with this Ayatollah, make it clear. He's 85 and he might even be in a coma now. So it'll be with an opportunity presents itself in the next couple of years. Could we see something quite dynamic, which is overdue? I remember being in Vienna International School in '79, just I'd arrived there when
all the Iranians came,
and we met some Persians that were there, and how game-changing it was. And it's not really changed ever since. Yeah. And we've allowed it over 3 decades now for Iran to have such a poisonous influence, which is now, of course, affecting support for Hamas in Israel and so on. It's Hezbollah Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in the Yemen. But Bahrain and elsewhere, Iraq and Syria, they dominate. Iran's proxy influence is huge. Let's change that.
Yeah. One question I like to ask the people that we invite to the podcast are: if somebody says, what literature would you recommend? You've got a whole library there behind you. It looks very similar to mine. What books on leadership stand out to you? What would you recommend?
I enjoy Kissinger's World Order just because it places into context, what's going on in the wider scheme of things. I would strongly encourage, particularly because what's coming over the horizon, is just try and understand the back picture between our relationship with Iran, Russia, and China over the last 50 to 100 years, because we've not been particularly nice to all three countries. They remember their history. We don't.
Yeah.
Many Brits will know that we gave Hong Kong back to the Chinese not long ago. They haven't got a clue as to how we got it in the first place. Yeah. The fact that we made China high, that we control its foreign policy. We gave them, the Opium Wars, what they call the century of humiliation. Yeah. They remember that.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah. Iran is another one whereby we went there, British Petroleum, BP, the oil company, started in Persia. And we gobbled up a lot of their oil.
And we don't have to get started on India or parts of Africa where there was a similar story.
And that was a great game with Russia as well as to what actually happened there too. And this is perhaps, the challenge. So understanding these three countries, so anybody that's interested in understanding where we're going in the future needs to just have a basic understanding of the past, a little bit of the past. And that's what I would learn, just our relationship, because it's even the Americans, what America did with China and so on. When the Chinese Civil War took place and the nationalists did a runner to Taiwan, Kuomintang ended up there. And the war ended. The communists had won. They're the victors. They're in Beijing. Now, who did we give the seat, the permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council that we just set up? Yeah, we gave it to the Taiwanese, to Kuomintang, because we recognize them, not the winners of the Civil War, China. And it took 3 decades before we then said, I think we better give the seat to the The actual winners.
What you're basically saying is that old saying, the chickens are coming home to roost. I think, yes, I think there's some dynamics in world politics. I think if you really want to understand the predicament, you need to understand what is our ownership in the predicament that we're in. I also find it very interesting that after leaving Afghanistan, I think in a perfect crossover, Chinese industrialists were moving in and securing the rights to lithium mines. Where I'm saying what we have the disadvantage, but we're not willing to take the advantage. So there's some interesting points there. Another tradition we have in our podcast is I've got two wonderful people that you met beforehand who helped me film this, and I use them as my judges of how the podcast went, because this is not their topic. If they're falling asleep, it's usually a bad sign. They're still awake. What I also like to do is I find them brilliant, because often people who maybe don't have a contextual relationship to the topic that are talking have great questions, right? So Nelly and Rico, you got questions for Tobias? They're pointing at each other. I'll call it back to you if you don't hear her. Are you talking about voters? Okay. So she says that one of the driving forces right now is this kind of this perception of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, where it's very easy to drive voter behavior or voter feelings based on fear, and you kind of addressed it yourself. What is tell me if I get the question right. What is some of the ownership? How can we maybe take some self-responsibility? What are things that we as voters can maybe do to placate or create a more reasonable response to the anxieties? Because there's a lot of there's a lot of people are kind of apprehensive. 2024 was okay, but I'm kind of anxious about 2025. I don't know what's around the corner. What would you say to your own constituency if they asked you about this topic?
That's a really interesting question, because my concern is that it is the very voters themselves that need to change, that can affect change. My view is that we're not spending enough on defense, on security. There's a big debate at the moment as to whether we're actually in a gray zone war with Russia. And I've just written another article today, in fact, that makes that very case, because we're constantly bombarded. But because we can't really see it, then we're sort of in denial. And if we're in denial, we don't really spend any money on it. And if the British people aren't feeling it, they don't then demand that our parliamentarians spend money on it. And why would you spend money on something that you can't really see when you really want money spent on your hospitals, your schools, and your policing and elsewhere? The trouble with that, you say 2024 wasn't so bad. What's 5 years from now going to be like? Is it going to be more dangerous or less? And if there's half a chance it can be more dangerous, we need to prepare for that. Because a lot of the time here, people are saying it's 1937. That's what they're saying.
Oh, I think if you go 100 years back, you're pretty close to where we were 100 years ago.
Yeah. In which case, what are we doing to prepare ourselves for that? And you either need an acute event, like a Sputnik moment, or something that happens that wakes everybody up, or the British people, American people turn around and say, this is now important for me. I'm happy for taxes to go up to make sure that our resilience is better, particularly in this asymmetric warfare zone, which is an all-of-society approach. Because every aspect, if somebody gets into your infrastructure, turns the lights out, and then you go dark for 48 hours, the chaos that will cause the economic harm, the political discord, the societal interruption is huge, and we're just not ready for that.
I think what you're alluding to is one of the key functions. I think being charismatic is just part of creating the appeal so that people listen to you. Being eloquent and being able to communicate so that you can communicate things concisely. But I think what you're referring to is one of the master skills of true leadership is when everybody's dealing with the status quo, to have the capability of having a realpolitik kind of perspective of where we are and what the different scenarios of the future might be, and taking action now to have a preemptive position towards that, so that just like you said, it's not going to be worse in 4 or 5 years. And I think that's a skill set that's really lacking in the industry, and I'm afraid also in politics to a certain extent. Rico, do you have any questions?
Like the elephant in the room is like, okay, we're talking about the British, there's England, here's Austria, and blah blah. But in fact, it's the elephant in the room is. I want to say there's the German say the best.
Mm-hmm. So there's this cultural concept or divide, which is kind of a construct between East and West.
Yeah, East and West, and South and North. There's a book I read years ago, Crash of Cultures.
Crash of Cultures, that's a famous book, yeah.
And it's also very controversial. But what do you think is the...
Well, that's a difficult question. Let me see if I can put it in different. So what he's saying is, in the classic cultures, one of the concepts, the political science concepts that we've always, I'm sure you were at university and we were kind of indoctrinated with, is the concept between West and East, which was a construct, a system construct, versus once we kind of overcame that, it became an issue between North and South, the economical versus political and military. And I think what Rico is referring to is that the elephant in the room for him as a citizen is, at the end of the day, he feels it's a war of cultures where if I understand this correctly, are we superimposing our values? For example, you've been in the Middle East very often. I think one of the things they're very sensitive to, on one hand, they embrace, I think, the Western concept to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent. And then they have this principle, hey, but we are we as well, or it's our culture matters as well. What's your take on this? I think what all cultures kind of have is this, and it comes from Chinese history, this concept of center of the universe or center of the world kind of mentality. How do you feel that plays into our political situation right now, and what do leaders have to do in the future to kind of counteract that maybe?
So it goes back to that original question, what do we stand for? And after the Second World War, we had that sort of big reset, what's called the Bretton Woods moment, if you like, where we created the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank. And they did well, got us through the Cold War, and then we became complacent. And what's happened is that other nations are now exploiting our complacency to uphold those values and standards, which we've not been willing to defend. And they now realize actually that perhaps it's not been in their interest to play ball along those lines. Why don't we try something else, which is a little less intrusive, doesn't ask so many questions about democracy, about human rights, about the rule of law. And of course, I'm referring to Russia, China, and Iran, particularly North Korea. But others as well, in the global south, as they're loosely called, are now realizing actually there's a competition here for the Bretton Woods construct, that actually our world could be splintering into two, and I'm not sure who's going to win. In fact, China looks like it might overtake America militarily, economically, technologically. They'll become more dominant if they continue on their current path. Well, why should I hang around listening and supporting America? Particularly when I see what's going on in America, doesn't look particularly attractive. Therefore, actually, I'm just going to keep myself to myself. I'm not going to bother challenging the interruption, the exploitation of our rules-based order. China wants to do something, fine. I'm not going to rock the boat. And that, I'm afraid, is where we are right now. It's because
But that's not what you're for, I don't believe.
No, that's the reality. You talk about realpolitik. That's where our world currently is.
Oh yeah, I think the the concept of opportunism. And I think the democratic principle has been strongly undermined by capitalistic principle. And I think I find it so strange that we are kind of endorsing more a feudalistic concept of society with robber barons and disparity of wealth than actually democratic principles. I think that's a big challenge that we face. Any other questions from you guys? Great, thanks. Tobias, we could talk endlessly. I do want to respect your time, though. It's been totally exciting for me. Thank you for your time. I think we've provided a little bit of insight into a number of different topics for our listener. I hope you had an enjoyable time. It wasn't too tedious for you. Thank you for your time. Any questions on your part before we?
No, it's been refreshing and delightful to be able to talk about these things, and great to catch up with you, my friend Mark.
Same here. Tobias, I wish you all the best, and I will keep track of next time you're in Vienna. Please reach out. We'll go for dinner, and I'll hold you to your. It wasn't a promise, but a thought of maybe going back into political law, because I think this is also a belief of leadership. I think true leaders don't aspire to leadership because they have such an inner calling to do it. I think the best leaders are those who become leaders because they see there's a gap that needs to be filled. And if nobody else is going to fill it, they fill it. I think it's a kind of a self-sacrificial concept. And I think we need more people who have the broader picture of who they're serving and what leadership is all about. As you mentioned beforehand, it's not about self-elevating yourself, but serving a greater whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time, Tobias.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.